Welcome to the webinar on the new Procedural Safeguards Rule 5123-10-01. This is Lori Myers, and I'm the training coordinator for the Early Intervention Program. Also with me is Diane Fox, who is the Early Intervention Program Manager. Today's presentation is designed to review basic information about the rule and address questions submitted from the field in advance. We will not be answering new questions submitted today, but we will collect them and address them in an FAQ document that we will post to our website. And that will be in the Providers page in the tile called Early Intervention Rules 2019. You'll just scroll to the bottom of that page and you'll see a section called Guidance Documents and FAQs. And the FAQs from all of our rule webinars will be posted there, including this one. So before we take a look at some key points from the rule, we wanted to remind you why procedural safeguards are an important part of the EI program. Procedural safeguards provide an umbrella of protection for infants and toddlers, their families, EI providers, and the department. In all situations, it is our responsibility to inform parents of their rights and to implement their procedural safeguards. In addition to revising the rule, the department has revised the early intervention forms used to provide information to parents and to obtain their consent for early intervention activities. We will have a separate webinar on the forms, and we will later convert this webinar into an online course.
To review from rule, a few definitions were added and some were clarified. Complainant, EI records, Part C, and participating agency were added. Take a few minutes to look at these new definitions. The definition of consent has been expanded. The definition of early intervention service coordinator specifies that an early intervention service coordinator must be credentialed by the department. The definition of early intervention services references the list of services now found in Appendix A. The definition of parent aligns with the federal definition and is broader than in the past rule. The definition of personally identifiable information has been clarified with more detail.
Let's review a few key points about parent consent. Consent must be obtained in advance of activities and procedures. The requirements for obtaining consent apply to all EI providers, not just EI service coordinators. The new forms are specific to each activity, for example, developmental screening, evaluation, and assessment. The forms meet the federal requirements for prior written notice. The rule emphasizes that early intervention is a voluntary program. Consent can be withdrawn at any time.
Next, let's review changes to the rule regarding prior written notice. One of the big changes is that we have added an optional waiver of the 10-day prior written notice. The new forms include a specific section related to this waiver, and the parent can initial that they are choosing to waive the prior written notice. The rule emphasizes that prior written notice must be provided in the parent's native language if possible. If the parent's native language is not a written language, prior written language must be translated orally or by other means. There are new prior written notice consent forms for each EI activity, and they meet state and federal requirements.
Retention of early intervention records. The new rule specifies that EI records must be retained until the child's 9th birthday. the department may retain some information indefinitely, for instance, the child's name, date of birth, and parent contact information.
This section on consent applies to all early intervention providers and any early intervention record. It is required by Part C of the federal regulations. There are no big changes from the previous rule. However, there are two new forms, EIO 6, which is consent for release and exchange of information, and EIO 7, consent for transition.
This section brings together into one rule requirements found throughout a number of sections of the previous rules. It details the different responsibilities EI service providers have regarding a parent's access to a child's record. This includes permitting a parent to review the EI record, complying with a parent's request to review the record no more than 10 days after the request is made, providing the parent with a list of the types and locations of the EI records maintained by the provider, and not charging a fee to search for or to retrieve the records. The EI program must provide at no cost an electronic or paper copy of any evaluations, child and family assessments, and IFSPs within 10 days of an IFSP meeting, only charging a fee for copies of EI records if the fee does not prevent the parent from having access to those records and keeping a record of anyone who accessed a child's EI records. The parent has the right to receive a response from the early intervention services provider for a reasonable request for explanation, interpretation of EI records, to request copies of EI records, and to have a representative inspect and review the EI records.
Section H describes the required steps when a parent wants a record amended. The parent may verbally or in writing ask the early intervention service provider to amend the record. The early intervention service provider makes the decision about whether or not to amend the record. This is new to the rule, but was drawn directly from the federal regulations.
Moving on to dispute resolution. The dispute resolution section was reorganized for clarity. The emphasis remains on the fact that the EI service coordinator has the ultimate responsibility for ensuring that the parent understands the dispute resolution options. These options are resolving informally at the local level, filing a complaint with the department. There is a change here that the complaint must be filed within 1 year after the alleged violation. Another option is mediation, and the last option is due process hearing. Let's look at some details related to these options.
After filing a complaint, the parent may request investigation by the department, mediation, or a due process hearing. The department may conduct an on-site investigation, give parties a chance to submit additional information, and provide the opportunity for the parties to resolve the complaint. The department has 60 calendar days to complete the investigation and issue a final written decision. If the parent disagrees with the decision, he or she may pursue mediation or a due process hearing. If the issue the department is investigating has already been resolved through due process, the department must follow the decision in the due process hearing and inform the parent. The department must also resolve any complaint that alleges the department or early intervention service provider has not implemented a due process hearing decision.
The parent always has a right to request mediation. It is voluntary for all parties. Thus, both the parent and the person or entity against whom the parent's allegations have been made must agree. Mediation allows the parties to settle the issue without an investigation or due process hearing. The department covers the cost of the mediator. If the parties come to an agreement with the assistance of the mediator, they are required to produce a legally binding agreement detailing the dispute and the resolution agreed upon by both parties. If mediation is not able to produce an agreement, the parent retains the option of requesting an investigation of the complaint or pursuing a due process hearing. The parent now has 1 year from the alleged incident to file a complaint for due process. The department appoints a due process hearing officer who must provide a written decision within 30 days of receiving the complaint. If the parent chooses to be represented by an attorney, the parent bears the cost of the attorney. If the parent disagrees with the findings of the due process hearing, he or she may pursue a civil case. So now it's time to move on to the questions that we received ahead of the webinar. So I'm going to read the first question. The question is, at our welcome visits, we're getting consent from parents to share information with our core team members that are not county board employees. Is that necessary since they are part of our EI system?
Great question. So welcome visits, I'm going to interpret as our first contacts or one of our first visits. So that's when we're explaining early intervention and requesting the parents after we inform them of the activities that we are seeking their consent for. So the question is, during these early visits, are we getting consent from parents to share information with our core team members that are not county board employees? Is this necessary, or are they part of our system? So no consent to share or release information is required for early intervention service providers, and as defined in B7 of this rule. So if they're part of the early intervention system, like our vision, our hearing providers, our system of payment providers, and our county board providers, they're all part of our early intervention system, and so no release of information is needed.
All right, so moving on to our next question. If a family gives consent for EI to share information with the LEA, are our core team members free to discuss the child with the school district, or do they need to have separate consent?
Okay. So if you look at Rule 10-01 or the full 5123-10-01, definitions for early intervention program, early intervention record, and early intervention provider and participating agency. Any person, provider, agency providing services in accordance with the EI rules and procedural safeguards is part of the early intervention system. And I did not answer the right question, did I? So page 3, second question. Lori, are you there? Lori?
I'm here.
Oh,
Yes.
I answered the wrong question.
Oh, okay. Do you want to go back to, let's see.
This is if a family consents.
Yes.
I'm going to repeat the question and then I'll answer it again.
Okay. So the question is, if a family gives consent for EI to share information with the LEA, are our core team members free to discuss the child with the school district, or do they need to have separate consent?
So the consent to share and release information with and to the LEA is applicable to the early intervention system. So for sharing, exchanging information, there is a consent. There is a form, a consent form for the EI system to use. And parents must consent to sharing and exchanging information with the LEA.
All right. So our next question is about Form EI-01. Does the consent for screening include consent for the nutrition, vision, and hearing screenings in addition to developmental screenings?
Okay, so this is a change. Nutrition, vision, and hearing are now included in the requirements for evaluation and assessment, and this is consistent with the federal regulations. This information will also be covered in our training for Rule 5123-10-02. Form EI-01, as stated in the purpose statement, is only applicable to the developmental screening.
All right. So we have a few more questions. The next two are about Form EI-07. Both this form and EIDS now use the language asking if the parent gives consent to a TPC. Our understanding is that every child has a transition planning conference. Aren't service coordinators required to do transition planning for all children, even if the family doesn't want to invite the LEA? And when is an example of when a parent could opt out of transition planning?
So this is addressed in Rule 5123-10-02. So it's our eligibility and service rule, and it includes the requirements for transition planning and the transition planning conference. The new rules are aligned with the federal requirements that the parent provide consent. The transition planning conference is only conducted with parent consent. So only with parent consent. And this is clarified in the training, the rule recording for Rule 5123-10-02.
It's hard to say all those numbers.
I know. I just do it by eligibility and services. That's it.
Exactly.
2 is
Much
eligibility and
easier.
services. So really, hopefully answered all portions of that question. Consent must be obtained to invite the LEA to the transition planning conference.
Okay. All right. And sort of a follow-up question also about EI-07. It appears this consent gives permission for the child's information to go on the LEA report. Is there a time frame in which this consent can or must be completed?
Yes, there are requirements, and they are addressed in another rule, which is 5123-10 or 10-02. So in the eligibility and services rule, this is addressed.
All right. I think this is our last question, and this is about Rule 5123-10-01, so procedural safeguards, paragraph D2C. The question is, it says prior written notice must be provided in the native language of the parent who is responsible for this. If a service provider is completing the prior written notice, is it their responsibility to submit the prior written notice to the service coordinator in the family's native language? And does the service coordinator then need to get it translated? And what means are available for doing so?
Okay, so this requirement has not changed. So your local agency has been responsible for implementing this in our previous rule. So for the resources available, I would encourage you to seek out your contract manager or your early intervention supervisor to see what local resources you have available, and reach out to your program consultant for additional resources. But prior written notice and native language requirements are the responsibility of all EI service providers. Typically, the EI service coordinator will be providing the prior written notice in most circumstances.
All right. So it looks like those are all the questions that we had. So it's almost time to wrap everything up. Before we do that, I just want to remind you of a couple of resources that are out there for you. As we mentioned at the beginning, We will be answering any questions submitted today in an FAQ that we'll post on our website. We'll also be including the questions submitted ahead of time, so it will be a comprehensive questions document, and that will be under Providers, and then the new Early Intervention Rules 2019 tile. We also wanted to remind you of some other resources that are on that same page of the website. There are other recordings of webinars about the new rules. This one will be posted there as well. And there are some other guidance documents and FAQs about different sections and different rules that you'll find there. So those will all be posted in the EI Rules 2019 tile, so make sure you check that out. We'll be posting all of that, as many of those as we can before July 1st. Some of them may be a little bit delayed, but we'll get as close to that as we can. So make sure you check out the website, which is ohioearlyintervention.org. And thank you very much for participating today, and have a great day.